Well, it's been a little while since I released a Theology Behind the Imagery episode, but with the release of the newest animation, there were a few scenes that I wanted to really specifically unfold and talk about why I did them the way I did. You'll notice that very intentionally, a lot of this animation is dark, and with the scene of the crucifixion, it becomes bright. I wanted to make the crucifixion almost blindingly bright, and that was theologically driven. So I'm specifically drawing from John's theology of the cross that we see in the Gospel of John and the epistles of John and in Revelation. So for John, the lifting up of Christ on the cross is the lifting up of Christ in glory. So when Jesus is on the cross, dying, suffering, that is where He is most glorified. That is the point in all of creation where God is most glorified. So before we go on, I think a helpful thing to do would be to define the glory of God. The theologian Jonathan Edwards took a lot of time thinking through this issue, what the glory of God is. And in his treatise on the end for which God created the world, Edwards defines the glory of God essentially as the beauty of the internal fullness of God being made known outside of God, and being made known in such a way that it is not only known but also loved, because to know God truly is to love Him. So what is glory? What's inside God being shown outside God. The beauty that's in here being displayed out here. That's a basic description of what God's glory is. And we see this in the Bible probably most clearly in Exodus 33:18. So here Moses says to God, he's on Mount Sinai, and he says to God in verse 18, "Please show me your glory." And how does God respond? He says, "I will make all my goodness pass before you, and I will proclaim before you my name, the Lord," or Yahweh. So Moses says, "Show me your glory." And God says, essentially, "I'll tell you my name. I'll show you who I am. I will display to you the goodness of my character, my nature, and I'll speak to you my identity." That's my glory. So what's the glory of God in this paradigmatic Old Testament passage? The glory of God is who He is, the beauty of who He is declared outwardly. And then Moses is given the grace to receive that declaration and fittingly love and rejoice in it. And so God's glorified. So that's a lot, but it's really important to realize that God's glory is Himself made known. The glory of God is God made known. Okay, so back to John's Gospel. If God's glory is God made known, how then is the crucifixion of Christ the supreme, the climactic, the definitive declaration of the glory of God in all creation? Well, it's because when God the Son pours Himself out in love and in death on the cross, He is saying, this is who God is. This is what God is like. This is the name of God. And what is the name Jesus is declaring on the cross in His death? Not with His words, but in His flesh and His blood and in His outpoured life. What's the name He's declaring? It's the same name Moses hears on Sinai. It's when Jesus is lifted up on the cross, here is what He is saying in act and in body and in life poured out. This is what He's saying. Exodus 34:6-7. Yahweh, Yahweh, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the third and fourth generation. And Exodus 25 would add to the third and fourth generation of those who hate Him. And so this is the name Christ makes known in His death on the cross. He's saying, Yahweh, Yahweh, a God merciful and gracious, pouring Himself out in love, doing all that's necessary for the forgiveness of sins so that people can come to Him and enjoy Him as their life. Abundant mercy and steadfast love. But he doesn't clear the guilty. And the cross declares that, because in Christ the guilty are being crushed, the guilty are being punished, because Jesus is absorbing the wrath of God toward all the guilty parties who will trust in him. So the name made known on the cross is the same name made known on Sinai to Moses, except it's screamed from the cross, and in comparison it's whispered on Sinai. But it's the same name, the same God being made known. That's why the cross is the climax of the glory of God within the sphere of creation. So this theological dynamic of Christ being most glorified in his death is what I was trying to visually draw out in this animation. So here, the moment of his death is dark, which is paralleling what we read in John 13:30, where Judas leaves to betray Christ. It says, he went out and it was night. So it's dark. It's physically dark, but it's spiritually dark. It was night. Christ is going to the cross. And then Jesus says, now is the Son of Man glorified. And God is glorified in him. If God is glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself and glorify him at once. And so you get this dynamic of, at the darkest, the glory shines the brightest. And so I wanted to show in the animation, at the darkest point, the sky went black, is what the lyrics say, but darkness had not won, and that's where the glory of Christ in his crucifixion begins to shine. And then I just increased the light to show visually what's happening, the glory of God, the beauty of God, the name of God being made known in his Son crucified. So this final scene where we're pulling out from the crucifixion, and there's these radiating blooms of light coming off from Christ, was a intentional kind of visual echo of an illustration done by Gustav Verdi. He drew it for Dante's Divine Comedy, and his illustration is depicting what's called the Beatific Vision, or kind of the ultimate self-communication of God to the creature, to the individual. And of course, the Beatific Vision here on earth is the cross. That's where we see God. That's where God makes himself known to us with climactic, definitive finality. And to the eyes of faith, when we read of the crucifixion of Christ here, we see the glory of God in the face of Christ, not a face marred beyond human recognition, though that is what happened to Christ. But faith sees in that marring beauty, divine beauty, the beauty of holiness, the beauty of love, the beauty of God. And so intentionally I was trying to say visually, this is the beatific vision. This is where we see God, him, Jesus Christ, crucified. And of course, he will be raised. The cross is not beauty unless Christ is raised from the dead. And so that's what I'm trying to get across here with these brilliantly bright crucifixion scenes. I'm trying to say what John says in his gospel, that paradoxically and yet fittingly, our God, Yahweh, creator of heaven and earth, is most climactically known by his creatures at the cross of Christ, where he pours himself out in love so that they might know and enjoy him for eternity.